Most men, when they lose someone, don't grieve in the way they perhaps expected to. They don't fall apart. They don't sob at the funeral. They often just go back to work. And then, maybe 6 months later, something happens, and it turns out the grief was there all along. It just looked like something else. Welcome to the Quiet Midlife. Today I'm talking about grief, and I don't mean the textbook version of the 5 stages that neatly progresses us towards some form of acceptance, but what grief looks like when it applies to a man. So let's begin. When people think of grief, they picture sadness of the sort that's visible and expressed. In other words, unmistakable sadness. So we're thinking here of tears at the funeral, the inability to talk about it without breaking down, and then that awful, slow, painful journey towards something that maybe even resembles recovery. Well, that's a version that's real enough. It certainly exists, and it deserves all the support we can give it. But it's only one version, and for a lot of men, it's not their version. Men do grieve, let me say that plainly. Men feel loss as deeply as anyone. What often differs is the way it's expressed. Quite often, it doesn't come out in the ways that anyone around them is expecting, which means it frequently goes unrecognized, unsupported, and unresolved. And unresolved grief has got a way of turning up in other places. There's a concept in the bereavement literature called instrumental grieving, and instrumental grievers, so-called, process their loss through activity rather than emotion. They organize things, they fix things, they go for very long runs, they throw themselves into work. And it can look to onlookers as if they're maybe avoiding their grief. They're not. They're just processing it through a channel that feels the most natural to them, which is doing something rather than feeling something. It's more common in men than women, and it's not a lesser type of grief, so much as grief in a different form. The problem is that in a culture which equates grief with visible emotional distress, it tends to look at the man who came back to work on a Monday, and it concludes he was never really that upset. Or maybe he's just handling it really well. He's fine. He's moving on. Actually, what he's doing is what he knows how to do, and he's just hoping it's enough. Well, sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. So if not tears, what are we looking at? If we're looking for outward signs, then the most obvious one is anger, the short fuse, disproportionate reactions, a kind of simmering hostility that doesn't seem to have any obvious target. This is the man who, say, loses his father and becomes, over the following months, increasingly hard to be around. He's not failing to grieve, he's just expressing it in the only way he feels it's available to him. But beneath that anger is generally something much softer. It's something that he's never got to express because the way to express it isn't terribly obvious to him. It's within his grasp, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. The second sign relates to physical symptoms. Grief lives in the body, for men especially, who are more likely to experience emotional difficulty through physical channels. Grief can manifest as fatigue, as pain, digestive problems, or a kind of general physical depletion. The man who goes to his doctor several times in the months after bereavement with these kind of vague physical complaints may actually be presenting the physical face of grief without either him or the doctor realizing what's going on. The third sign is withdrawal. Withdrawal is something more people recognize as the effect of grieving, going quiet, turning down invitations, being in the room but somehow not really being there. It's a type of grieving that's managed privately. You keep the loss contained, and you maintain the appearance of functioning, but which, if it goes on long enough, can turn into isolation. And isolation, not surprisingly, makes everything worse. And the fourth, perhaps the most common and the least recognized, is simply staying very, very busy. If you're never still, you never have to feel it. That's the logic. Superficially it works, until it doesn't. Now there's a dimension to grief that men are particularly poor at acknowledging, and that's secondary losses. When a man loses a partner, he doesn't just lose the person, he loses the entire structure of his days. He loses his primary social connection, because for many men, the partner was the person who organised the social life, maintained the friendships, and kept the world connected. When that person dies, both the person and that infrastructure go together. When a man loses a parent, particularly a father, he loses the relationship that shaped his understanding of what it means to be a man. The unfinished business of that relationship tends to surface with particular force at the father's death, because the possibility of resolution has closed. And when a man loses a close friend, which matters more than a lot of men tend to acknowledge, given how thin the friendship networks of many men have become, he may be losing one of the very few people who actually knew him. Most grief, however painful, follows a certain trajectory. The acute phase gradually gives way to something a bit more integrated. The person is never forgotten, and the loss is never unfelt, but life resumes a kind of quality and engagement and a forward orientation. So-called complicated grief is when that natural process doesn't happen. The symptoms persist. The loss feels as raw 6 months or a year later as it did in the first weeks. There's an inability to accept what's happened, a withdrawal from life that simply doesn't lift. It's much more common than people realize, and men who experience it are significantly less likely to ask for help. And they're much more likely to present with the secondary consequences, which are things like depression, alcohol problems, and physical health deterioration. If any of that sounds familiar, if grief from months or years ago still feels unmanageable, well, that's worth a conversation with your doctor. All of which brings us to what might help. Well, there's a few things the research is clear about. Social connection matters more than emotional disclosure. Men don't necessarily need to process grief through talking, and expecting them to might be counterproductive. But contact, even superficial contact, maybe at the pub, just being around people without having to discuss the loss at all, provides some kind of sense of not being alone, and that's one of the more reliable predictors of grief recovery. The instrumental griever's tendency to process through doing is not inherently a problem. Physical activity in particular has got measurable benefits for mood and stress regulation during bereavement. The question is whether the activity is part of engaging with the loss or a way of permanently avoiding it, and time, genuine time, matters. The expectation that a man should be back to functional within a few weeks simply isn't supported by the research. Grief takes as long as it takes, and men benefit from the permission to acknowledge this rather than trying to perform some kind of recovery ahead of schedule. It's not a competition. In the UK, Cruise Bereavement Support provides free bereavement counselling. Their website is at cruise.org.uk. In the US, What's Your Grief at whatsyourgrief.com provides accessible, evidence-informed resources. The man who appears to be handling it may not be handling it at all. He may be managing it, which is a bit different. The signs worth watching for, well, the anger that doesn't have an obvious target, the withdrawal that's just going on too long. Now, I know that too long is a somewhat abstract concept, but as a yardstick, let's say after many months, we're looking at the busyness that never stops, the anger that seems to increase rather than diminish, and the continued stubborn refusal for support. So whilst needing space is perfectly normal, long-term withdrawal certainly isn't. Now, as much as I might like to draw a neat line beneath this, I can't. There's no bullet point list that encompasses the intense personal nature of grief. What I will say is, grief isn't a process that men are particularly bad at. It's a process that they do differently. And it's something that a culture built around one particular version of grieving often fails to recognize or support. The man who came back to work on Monday and organized everything and seemed fine, well, okay, he may have been fine. Or he may have been carrying something that just needs more time and more space. If you're carrying something like grief, sometimes from months ago or even years ago, that hasn't quite resolved, it's never too late to give it the attention it deserves.